Good morning, everyone. Happy to be back with this group again. I really think one of the most favorite trainings that I have, not this particular topic, but just working with this group, diagnosticians and psychologists. And I know there are a handful of directors that have been on here, but I've really enjoyed this whole series. So I hope you guys have as well. I wanted to take just a minute. I know some of you were with us for the last training on specific learning disabilities, but just wanted to give an opportunity, if she's willing, for Angie Vaughn to introduce herself to the group for those of you who may not have been part of the last group. Angie, would you like to jump in and just give a quick introduction?
Yes, thank you. As Angie mentioned, I'm Angie Vaughn. And I have recently come on board with the Department of Education. I'm working primarily with low incidence and indicator 11, so evaluations. But I recently was the special education director at Madison Consolidated Schools, so just recently out of the field to the DOE world. And so I really hope to maintain that connection with the schools and hear from you all. So as we go through, part of my being here is to put a face with a name so that if you have questions, we do have the indicator 11, the evaluation pre-verification will be coming out soon, probably today. So if you have any issues with that, let us know. And then, we'll be working through that, gearing up for the evaluation report coming in. So as we work through that process, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions of how we can work through that process better. And again, Angie, thank you for the opportunity. This is a great resource to have available, and definitely have worked with educational diagnostician work through our district and really found that to be beneficial. So thank you for the opportunity, and don't hesitate to reach out if anyone needs anything.
Great. Well, we're glad you're here. I am going to put the link to the Padlet in the chat again. The handout for today has been uploaded, so it's at the bottom of the very first column on the Padlet. I figured out it was my error the last time why the handout wasn't showing up on the Padlet right away. So I think I figured out what I did wrong, and hopefully we'll correct that mistake from here on out. So today's topic is all about functional behavioral assessments and behavior plans, and really linking the two of them. I know we have a lot of trainings that happen about kind of how to use the IEP system and how to fill in the boxes. And this will talk a little bit about that, but it's really not about how to use the system. It's more about, no matter what you do, no matter what kind of form you have, what kind of process your district uses, how do we pull all that together? And how do we actually create plans that maybe have a shot at working? Because I think, sometimes we go through paperwork and we create plans and we kind of know in advance that's not going to work, but I have to do it, right? I have to create this. We definitely want to put the effort in where it's going to make a difference for the student. So here's what I'm thinking as far as an agenda. I have it chunked out into the whys, the whens, then the hows related to doing FBAs. When do we have to? When should we? All that kind of stuff. And then we'll move into the behavior intervention plan piece. So the rules for this group. Jump in anytime, just unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm kind of going between two screens here, so I may not see a hand pop up or anything like that. So just feel free to interrupt if you have questions or if you want to add to it. We have a couple of places where I do want you to jump in, either vocally or in the chat so that we can try to come up with some different ways to support students. So let's start with functional behavioral assessments. So we have a definition specifically in Article 7, and it's really focused on what we're trying to do is find out what patterns are there and what is a student trying to communicate, say, accomplish by their behavior. So we know that all behavior is communication. I mean, every time we act, we're communicating something, whether it's a need, whether it's a want, whether it's, you know, that we're unhappy, that we're uncomfortable. Pretty much everything we do is trying to communicate something. And so doing that functional behavioral assessment is us trying to put together all the data in a way that we can figure out what in the world is that student trying to communicate. Now, it specifically says in the Article 7 definition that we may or may not need permission. And so it is important that we know when we have to have permission to do that or not. And it basically comes down to if we are going to gather new data, then we've got to have permission. If we're looking at existing data, then we don't need to have permission. And I know some of you have probably encountered times when a parent has maybe said, I'm not giving permission for a functional behavioral assessment. Well, we don't need permission unless we're going to gather new data. And I think sometimes parents get confused about exactly what is an FBA. You know, some parents have even said, I'm not going to put my child through that. Well, your child's not really having to do, it's mainly on us. It's on us as the adults to put all the data together and gather it. It's not like sitting down for a 2-hour academic battery or something like that. And I think sometimes that's hard for parents to understand. So we would want to conduct a functional behavioral assessment. Number one, if we're not figuring out what's going on, why in the world is a behavior occurring? If I already know why and I am crystal clear, then I don't need to do some sort of formal assessment to figure it out, right? It's intuitive. We figured it out. But there are lots and lots of times when we're working with students that we're like, I'm not sure what's going on. I need to really pull together all the information in order to figure out why is this behavior happening. We also would want to do an FBA if we need to develop a BIP. Now, it is kind of, I don't think it ever specifically says in Article 7 that you need to do an FBA in order to develop a behavior intervention plan. But when we get to the definition for a behavioral intervention plan, it refers to that plan being based on the results of an FBA. So it does say it, just not in very clear terms that says, you know, you need to do this first. We'll talk about why we would want to do a functional behavioral assessment first as we get into more of the specifics about the functional behavioral assessment. There are also very specific times when Article 7 says, I don't care what happens or, you know, whether you think you already know this or not, it's required. So we're going to look at those specific conditions too. So here's what Article 7 says. The only place as far as the initial evaluation is concerned that a functional behavioral assessment is required is when we're looking at an emotional disability. Now, your district may say differently. Your district may require it as part of an autism evaluation. And I think that's okay. We are allowed to be more restrictive in different cases. And there are a lot of times when we have certain disability areas where a functional behavioral assessment would be a darn good idea if we're dealing with a lot of behaviors. But the only specific legal requirement has to do with the evaluation for ED. We're also required to do an FBA when the student's gotten in trouble and we have gone to a manifestation determination and we've determined that there is a manifestation relationship. There's a causal relationship there. The student's behavior was connected to their disability. And even when we say, well, they got in a lot of trouble, yes, they're up for a removal, and we've decided it is not a manifestation of their disability. If it's appropriate to do an FBA, the team has to make a decision about whether or not we want to complete that. And again, as appropriate, if a student has been removed to an interim alternative educational setting. So that's only those conditions where you've brought a weapon to school, drugs, or you have injured someone so severely that they could have lost a limb or died. That's serious bodily injury. If those situations have occurred and the administrator has unilaterally removed you to an interim alternative educational setting, then the team needs to think about, do we need to do a functional behavioral assessment to make sure that we don't have this problem again? And also, again, in kind of some sketchy wording in Article 7, we need to do a functional behavioral assessment before completing a behavioral intervention plan. Now, let's back that up just a little bit. If we're creating a formal BIP, then absolutely, we want to have done a functional behavioral assessment somewhere along the way. If you're just writing a behavior goal, we have a lot of students that we already know what's going on, and maybe we're just writing a goal. Then it is not necessary to have a functional behavioral assessment, unless, back to those original situations, we don't know what's going on, right? We don't know why the behavior's happening. So if I don't have a question, I know why it's happening, I know what you're trying to communicate to me, and we just need to support you, then you probably don't need one at that point. So in creating a behavior plan, doing a functional behavioral assessment helps us to make sure that we're going to have a plan that is supporting the right stuff and basically not feeding the beast, okay? So not making a situation worse. And just to give you an example, we have a kid who's standing up, they're dancing around in the middle of class, and so the reaction is, we're going to remove the student to remove the audience, right? Well, if the function of behavior was to get attention, then that would make sense. However, in this case, if the function of the behavioral had nothing to do with attention, but had to do with escaping the situation, we've now created a stronger connection between the behavior and the student getting their needs met. So having a good understanding of why a behavior is occurring helps us to not create a plan that sounds really good on paper, but is actually making the situation worse. So we want to know as much as we can about the student's behavior. And sometimes that takes time. Sometimes that takes more data. And quite honestly, sometimes that takes trial and error. Sometimes we think we've got a good handle on the student's function. However, we try some things out and think, oh my, no, that wasn't it at all. So trial and error sometimes happen, or doing a functional analysis. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a minute. So this is what the system looks like for any of you who maybe haven't filled this in the IEP system. The system is strictly a series of boxes that no matter what you're using as far as your paperwork, your process for an FBA, because again, I know districts are using different things, and that's okay. This is not the functional behavioral assessment. This is a place for you to summarize what you got from your functional behavioral assessment. So it gets into, you know, some just really basic things of, okay, well, what is the behavior? What does it look like? And again, from the district that I used to work in, we had probably an 8 to 10 page packet that was our functional behavioral assessment that we used, that sometimes was supplemented with other things such as rating scales or outside observations or things like that. But all of these things could kind of be pulled from that packet of data. So information about, you know, what are we looking at? What is the behavior? And getting super specific. So we can't use terms like disrespect or, you know, hyperactive behavior, because those are the kinds of things that I don't know whether I would see it and you would see it in the same way if we came into a classroom to look at a student. We might describe those things differently. So very specifically, if I walked into a classroom, what am I going to see? How often do you think I'm going to see it? How severe is it? All of those kinds of things. And then any of the information that we know that are related to precipitating factors, you know, outside information that we might have about a student. Do they have a medical issue or a diagnosis of some kind? Specifically looking at our kids that have speech and language difficulties. No matter how severe, when you have trouble communicating, your behavior really, really does the communicating for you. And when you get frustrated and can't get your message across, sometimes we see pretty significant behavioral concerns. I think a lot of our speech language pathologists think, well, I'll probably never have to do a functional behavioral assessment. And man, were they wrong. They're doing these a lot because of that communication issue. Setting events is looking at, where do I see it? Where do I not see it? When? What kinds of settings? You know, do you only see it in the classroom? Do you only see it in those more unstructured areas? Do you only see it in specific situations that get really loud? You know, sometimes we have kids that have complete meltdowns in music class and in the gym, and everywhere else things are pretty good. And that's telling us something. We're always looking at what is the data telling us. You may also see patterns related to specific personnel, you know, specific adults or specific other kids that may be around or not around when certain behaviors tend to be more prevalent. Antecedents, so things that happen right before the behavior. And I really do mean right before, not just things that lead up to it, but you will have seen this happen, and typically the behavior happens almost immediately after. And then consequences, okay, well, what happens right after? What does the teacher do? What do other kids do? Are there changes in the environment? All of those kinds of things. And then also related deficits. Sometimes we know that kids struggle with certain behaviors because they don't have a skill that they need. Sometimes they don't have the fluency with certain behaviors. They can do it under the right conditions, but under less than perfect conditions, you're not going to see an appropriate behavior come out. So just what all do we know about the kid? So again, you may have a practice within your district that you are going to complete specific paperwork and upload that to the system. You're still going to need to fill this out, or somebody will, within the Indiana IEP system. So this is kind of, no matter what paperwork you're using, this is kind of how the process plays out. So we start with what the behaviors are, get very specific about what do they look like, and then really have to narrow it down, because I know probably some of you have worked on a functional behavioral assessment in the past where the teacher or the parent have a list of like 10 things that they're really concerned about. And, you know, we always say, well, okay, but what is the one or two biggest things that we need to work on right away? Because we can't work on everything at once. So, you know, really narrow it down. If you could just fix one or two of these things and support these, then maybe some of the others would kind of come along with that. Then we want to start with figuring out what all data do we already have, because honestly, we may have plenty of data, but there are times when we need to gather more information. Sometimes I think we have plenty of data, we just haven't taken the time to really analyze it. But again, if you look at all the existing data and think, I need more, I need to do some interviewing, I need to do some rating scales, some observations, those kinds of things, then you're going to have to collect some additional data. And if so, that means you need to get a permission. I did see somebody asked about, could that be covered under other assessments as needed? I would say probably not, just because, I mean, legally it might be able to, but I would just be very specific about getting a permission for functional behavioral assessment, just because it tends to be associated with sometimes some legal issues. There are a lot of complaints and due process kinds of procedures that have had to do with behavioral issues. So I'd just be really careful about that one. Once we analyze all the data and we come up with what we think is a good function of the behavior, then we may need to test it out, right? Now, you could jump to a plan, but you can also do a functional analysis saying, okay, I think it's this, so let's try some short-term interventions to see how the student responds, to try and test out whether or not removing attention and putting these certain supports in place actually works or not. It can save you a lot of time and headache in the long run by doing just, you know, little trials, which is not the same as creating a formal plan that we're going to adopt as a as part of the IEP. It would just be just some little trial runs of things prior to creating the formal plan. And then sometimes you're back to the drawing board and you got to revise what you think the function is, revise the hypothesis if the information that you collect says, yeah, you didn't quite get it right. And again, that's okay, because it's a big cycle of we're constantly trying to figure out what makes a student tick, what they need, what supports might work. So typical existing data that we see a lot at school that we don't necessarily need a permission form to deal with. You may have things like Class Dojo or other class behavior systems. You know, we're hoping that teachers have moved on from the clip systems and the card pulling systems and looking at a lot more concrete data, but you know, sometimes you take what you can get. Attendance is good existing data. Attendance and looking at time out of the classroom or tardies or anything like that. Office referrals, going to see the nurse, going to see the school counselor, those, especially when you can analyze time of day, that can give you really good bits of information about what might be part of the setting events. classroom performance data too, that can help you look at not only the subject matter and whether or not a student may be acting out of, not being able to express that they don't get something. But it can also look at time of day. We know that sometimes students' medication can play a part in how well that they can get their needs met throughout the daytime, depending on how strong their medication is at different parts of the day. Sources of new data, collecting rating scales, interviews. It's really good to interview a variety of people. Interviewing the parents can tell you, well, this works at home, or I see this pattern at home. They can tell you a lot of really useful information. And one of your biggest sources of information is the student. If you don't talk to the student, I'm even talking about elementary school kids, when you ask them questions, they can tell you answers. It's surprising that when you say, why did you do that? You make it an, I don't know, or you make it a because, and they tell you exactly what you needed to know. Interviewing students can also really give us a lot of good information about what might work, what they need, what they're interested in, what would be rewarding. Doing a reinforcement inventory, no matter what the age of the student, can be really helpful. Using checklists, doing observations, doing good systematic observations, and then looking at things like ABC charts of helping to truly get in there while you're observing or having a teacher make note of those things that happen just before and just after a behavior. Because now I'm sure nobody else has experienced this, where a kid is having problems day after day after day, and you put it in your schedule to go in and do an observation, and they're perfect. They sit there and they do exactly what they're supposed to do. And so you schedule another day to come in and nothing happens. That happens so often. Just being in the room can make a difference for various kids' behaviors. So sometimes creating those charts and getting a teacher or maybe a paraprofessional in the room to help fill some of those things out can be helpful too. So lots of different descriptors that people have for the common functions of behavior. And you'll have arguments out there about, well, it could be this or it could be that. These are the most common. These are the most agreed upon functions of behavior out there. So things that are related to sensory, escape or avoidance, attention, and that could be attention from peers, attention from adults, could be both. And attention doesn't necessarily have to be positive. Most kids will take attention any way that they can get it. Or something tangible. I want something, I need something, or I want to be able to do something, that kind of tangible. So if you just think of the acronym SEAT for sensory, escape, attention, and tangible, those are your most likely ones. Now, what you don't want to fall into the trap of, I hear over and over again, it's control. This kid just wants control. Everybody likes a little control in their life, but I can almost guarantee you can take any of those cases where the adults in this kid's world have said, no, they just want to control the situation. They're most likely looking for something sensory or escaping or attention or something tangible. So thinking about as diagnosticians, there is nothing in Article 7 that says who needs to do an FBA. There are some school districts where the school psychologist is called in to help with an FBA or to complete FBAs, or a behavior consultant. It may be the special ed teacher or the speech language pathologist who are responsible for that. But there's nothing anywhere in the law that says who needs to do it or what kind of training you need to have. And so I think a lot of people are given a set of forms and being told, have fun with this. You need to complete this paperwork so that you have an FBA. And again, it is not about the paperwork. It's about the process. And you guys as diagnosticians can be a huge help in this process to either spearhead it or to support it, or, anywhere in between. So you may be really valuable in just sitting down with a teacher and helping them get a good handle on what their concerns are. So when I say, this kid's out of control, okay, well, tell me what that means. Tell me what that looks like. And even then when they tell you, it may be to get more specific. Tell me more about what I'm going to see when I come in your classroom. Tell me more about how severe this is. How long does it last? Anything that you can do to help really get it as specific as possible. You may be able to help the teacher narrow down the focus, either through a conversation or through looking at some data and saying, I'm noticing that of all the things that you're concerned about, this is the most frequent, or this one seems to last the longest, or seems to take up more of your time intervening when it happens, whatever that concern is. You may be able to help with interviewing teachers, parents, students to gather good information, looking at or collecting data, doing observations, or doing that functional analysis piece. If we can come up with a good potential intervention that might test out the function of behavior, you guys might be a person who could go in and help implement that. But I think the most important thing to know about an FBA is it is not a one-man show. So again, it's not about completing a packet of paperwork. It's about multiple heads coming together, and that it's not something that can be done quickly. So knowing where can I be a part of this, and yes, you may be the person doing a good chunk of the paperwork, but it has to be with input from other people. I know in analyzing data for a functional behavioral assessment, if I just look at all the data myself, I may come to one conclusion, but having a conversation with other people who know the student who are looking at the same data may lead to a very different conclusion. It's a process of figuring it out. So just know that you can jump in at any point. There is nothing that is a specific qualification other than feeling confident about doing what you're doing that is part of the FBA process. All right, once you know what the function is, now the fun comes in, which is got to build a plan, got to have something that's going to help support the student, help reduce the behaviors that we don't want, help increase the behaviors that we do want, probably need to teach skills. In most cases, your plan should include a component of it that is about what does this kid need to learn that they don't know. And I think that gets even harder as we move up into middle and high school, because the adult assumption is, oh, this kid knows how to behave. They just choose not to. This kid knows what to do. They just won't. And that's, in many cases, that is not the actual truth. Kids are either missing a skill that they need, or they are not fluent enough and practiced enough with a skill to be able to use it under conditions that just aren't optimal. And I think, I can remain calm and do the right thing when I'm not hungry, not cold, not too hot, not too overstressed. But when those kinds of things occur, my skill set goes out the window, right? And I think that's true for most adults is when I'm having a rotten day, even though I know the right thing to do, I don't always do it. I don't always eat right. I don't always hold my temper. I don't always use the right language, right? All of those things kind of go out the window when you're not in a good situation. And for a lot of kids, school is not a stress-free situation. So they're always dealing with, social pressures and distractions and being asked to do things that aren't fun for me and, all of these things that just make me compromised already. Okay, so let's go back to the whys. So when we're doing a behavior intervention plan, there are some times that Article 7 says you have to, whether you want to or not, whether you think it's the right thing or not, you have to because a certain situation has occurred. Or you're answering questions in a certain way and it just, boom, it leads you right into, well, then we have to do a behavior plan. You would also want to do them, anytime there's a major behavioral concern or a safety concern. And, we have a lot of our students that we have to worry about safety, either the safety for the student, like a student who unsafely handles materials, the kid who's waving scissors around, or a student who runs out of the building. We may be looking at safety for other kids. If I'm a biter, then y'all around me are not safe. So we have to work on those things to increase safety for everyone. You might want to do a behavior intervention plan when you've got some minor behaviors, but you want to make sure that they don't increase. You also may want to do it for things like increasing a student's social skills or their learning behaviors, like all of the behaviors that they need to have within a classroom to be successful students, like getting organized, raising my hand before speaking, starting a task when I'm told to start a task, those kinds of things that are important, that aren't necessarily that disruptive, and they aren't considered like a bad behavior, right? But they are things that are important within the classroom, and they are all behaviors nonetheless. So let's start with Article 7 again. This is copy and pasted straight out of Article 7. So from the definition, it says that it's a plan that is agreed upon by the case conference committee. So it's specifically talking about BIP in the context of a student in special education. So a plan agreed upon by the case conference committee and incorporated into the student's IEP. So we know that some people will just use the boxes that are within the Indiana IEP system, and others will put kind of the minimum that they can in that system and then upload a separate BIP. Doesn't really matter, as long as it's part of the IEP, it has to be incorporated in some way. And this is kind of where that FBA gets pulled in. It describes the pattern of behavior that is impeding the student's learning or the learning of others. I bet you recognize that question or that statement. And it also describes the purpose or function of the behavior as identified in a functional behavioral assessment. So again, even though it never specifically says do an FBA first, this is where it's telling you it needs to be based on an FBA at some point in time. Now, we may do an FBA and write a behavior plan, and then next year we write a different behavior plan, but it's still based on that same FBA that we feel is appropriate. So we don't always have to have a new functional behavioral assessment, But when we look back and think, my gosh, that FBA had to do with totally different behaviors than what we're seeing now, then it's probably time to do another FBA. So that first question, the first description piece, the pattern of behavior that impedes a student's learning or the learning of others, that is one of the questions in that section of the IEP that comes up. Does the student's behavior impede their learning or the learning of others? That's why that statement was put in there to begin with. Okay, it goes on to say, and I love these pieces because this is a big change for me from how I saw behavior plans implemented in my early part of my career. It needs to describe the positive, yes, positive interventions and supports to address the behavior, maximize consistency of implementation, and it also needs to, if this is needed, talk about the skills that we're going to teach and monitor to change that pattern of behavior. So, I think those pieces are incredibly important. And it goes on to say, you don't have to have a separate plan if you don't need to, as long as you've got all this stuff in there. But again, it's not wrong to upload a separate behavior plan on top of what is in the IEP system. Okay, so, and this is one place where it talks about you have to have a plan. So again, if a student has gotten in trouble for something that has brought them to the point of a change of placement, meaning you're up for expulsion, or you're up for a suspension or other removal that would take you to more than 10 days out from school. So we know that's serious. When we've hit that point, we're missing a ton of hours of instruction. So when we hit that point, we have to have a manifestation determination, and we've got to look at lots of different things. And we know when we go into those conferences, we're pulling together all their information. We're trying to figure out, did my disability have a significant relationship to what my offense was, right? Or could it also be that my IEP was not implemented correctly? Now, one of the areas where schools get dinged a lot in that number 2 is when a behavior plan was not followed. So if I've got a behavior plan and it didn't get followed, and that is what led to me having this behavior, then I'm back in class. So, it's really, really important for the students' behavior, for their success, but also to make sure that schools keep themselves in check, that we always implement the behavior plan. So if we get to the point to where we say here that the conduct was a manifestation of the disability, then I'm going to skip right on to the next page. We have to do an FBA unless we've already have one and it still looks good, and implement a behavioral intervention plan. Or if we already have a behavior intervention plan, and in a lot of cases we do, then we've got to take a look at it and see, was it appropriate? Do we need to change it? What do we need to do to try and ward off this behavior in the future? So if it's a manifestation, this kid is going right back to the placement that they came from. They're not being expelled. We need to put them back in whatever that placement is. And you want to make sure we've got a good behavior intervention plan so that we're not back at this table again, figuring out what's going on with the student. We're not having them have these repeated incidents. So we would want to do some kind of behavior intervention plan for any kid, special ed or not, that's having some significant needs, having some significant behaviors. We can do that as part of a preventative kind of measure, do it as part of multi-tiered system of support. In the gen ed world, we can do it as part of the IEP, but the bottom line is that earlier that we can do something like this, the better. Now, you don't want a behavior plan on everyone, right? Not every kid needs one, but you also don't want to come to a meeting with a parent and have really significant behaviors to talk about and not have put some effort into trying to intervene. And that's really what a plan is all about, is trying to get ahead of this, trying to support the right things, extinguish the things that we don't want. But the earlier that we can do this, the less likely that we're going to be writing behavior plans for super significant behaviors, because we're going to be out in front of it. So when we're not dealing with the special ed end of things, and I know some of you work in the intervention parts of your school as well, we're going to be looking at prevention of behaviors. And if we have interventions that are happening, this is good documentation too for us to have as part of the intervention process. So if you ask these questions, if everyone who's dealing with a student needs to know about the plan and know about the behavior, you probably want to have a formal behavioral intervention plan in writing. If there are steps to addressing things, I mean, okay, my dog, I'll give you a dog example. We've got a puppy, and it's been a total nightmare of behavior. And if I walk up with my squirt bottle and just hold it when he's scratching on my door, that's all it takes. That's one step, right? He sees the bottle. I don't even have to squirt the dog. He runs off and stops scratching the door. Boom. I don't need to have that in writing. It's a one-stepper, right? But if there are multiple steps of first try this, if that doesn't work, now try this. If that doesn't work, now try this. If there are lots of steps, you're going to want to have this in a formal written plan, because multiple people are going to need to have a copy of the plan in order to make sure that we're all doing it consistently. Or if it's a complicated situation, definitely want to have a behavior intervention plan. So again, you're going to need to ask yourselves too, do I need permission to do this? And again, if you're looking at existing information for a student who is a student with a disability, then you don't need permission in order to work on this. Oh, I'm sorry, my brain was on FBAs. Let me back up. With behavior intervention plans, if you are doing this as an intervention within general education, you don't necessarily need permission unless your district has specifically said, we don't do this without permission. However, what you do need to do is just the regular documentation notification that you send to parents, just like you would for a reading intervention or a math intervention. If you're doing something related to behavior, you're going to want to notify parents of, we're doing this differently and this is how we're going to monitor progress, but you don't need permission. Again, unless your district says, we're getting permission, and then you do whatever your district says. And then you're going to also want to think about within your school, do you involve the parent or the student? My advice is always involve the parent or student, or most likely your plan is not going to work. However, again, your district may have different policies about how you handle that. And then do we have to have a meeting? So when we have a student who the BIP is part of their IEP, we do have a meeting, or we make tweaks using the change the IEP without a meeting process. So you really want to think about within the general ed setting, do we want to have a meeting? Do we want to make this formalized? And I would say if it's gotten to the point of a student really needing a solid behavior plan, you probably should have a meeting. Even though it wouldn't necessarily be a requirement, it gets the parent connected. It lets them know what you're doing to try and support their child. And it also allows for one more opportunity for that parent to say, let me tell you what I do at home that works, because sometimes that can be some really, really good information for you. Okay, so here is kind of what the system looks like. And we're going to talk about some of the things that can go in the different boxes. So when you've said, okay, we need a plan, because you've answered the question, yes, the student has a behavior, and then you go on to that next question to say, and the student's behavior interferes with their learning or the learning of others. It takes you through that whole functional behavioral assessment summary, and then it asks you specifically right here at the beginning of the developed behavior intervention plan, what do you think the function of behavior is? So this is just a place for you to put that. And then it jumps into the different strategies. So again, this can serve as your behavior plan. So I'm going to start back here first. Proactive strategies is talking about, what do you want them to be able to do? Like, if I'm hitting, what should I be doing? If I'm yelling in class, what should I be doing? What are other kids doing to get that need met that this kid is not? Because they probably are going to have to be taught the skill, and they're going to have opportunities to practice this skill first under easy conditions, and then as things get a little bit more difficult, they're going to need to be able to have some practice time doing that, and with supports in order to get really good at it. Okay, and then we get just tons of other strategies, right? So specifically, if you look at the top of the page, this is just a little cheat reminder that you need to kind of differentiate between situations where there's a skill deficit, where I don't know how to do it, or that performance deficit where I'm just not fluent. And we have to support that differently. So that's only there just to keep your brain on that the whole time that you're developing this behavior intervention plan. So it starts out with instructional strategies and moves all the way down through the behavior goal or the skills that we're going to work on. So we're going to start with the instructional strategies. So the next several screens are just talking about each of those boxes or each of those sections. So you want to ask yourself first, does the student actually have the skill? Has anybody ever seen them be able to do this, what we want them to do? Or do they maybe have the skill, but they're not fluent? But definitely never assume that I'm just not doing because I don't want to, or because I don't like you, or, because I'm just oppositional. Even oppositional defiant disorder students will still have another reason behind that has to do with the function of behavior. So the instructional strategies may take very specific time for instruction. And if I'm going to need to teach this, that means that the teacher is going to have to carve out a time, whether it's the gen ed teacher, the special ed teacher, the counselor, whoever's working with the student has to actually make time that they could instruct the skill. It's kind of hard to do on some of these skills. Does it need to be, one-on-one? Does it need to be something where we're putting some time to teach this in a group? Do I need to have this kid working on, a module that teaches something? There could be lots of different ways that we instruct on the skill. Some of the things that we can do to help not only with the instructional piece, but with the fluency part of that is good modeling, right? Sometimes we do a lot as the adults around a student by processing things out loud so that they know what we're doing in our head. Man, I'm getting really frustrated. First, I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths. And then I think I'm just going to step away and get a drink for a minute. I mean, having a teacher do that in front of a classroom, you see the kids go, holy cow, she gets stressed too. They learn even from the general ed classroom teacher modeling some things like that, or modeling, I don't think I was clear in what I needed to tell you guys. Let me back up and let me tell you, let me give you the instructions differently. Whatever they need to do to model certain things. Providing opportunities for rehearsal and giving appropriate feedback. And we know that feedback is really, really critical for kids, but we should always be giving them feedback on things that they didn't already know. When I know I did really well on this, I don't necessarily need to hear it. They need the more specific kinds of feedback about here's something that you may not have even noticed, that you made really good eye contact with me when you said that, or you maybe reacted a little bit too quickly and maybe you need to take a few more seconds before you respond to this. Any kind of feedback that isn't going to be just the obvious of you worked really hard on that, or things that they're not really getting any information out of. But there should be some sort of instructional component to a behavior plan. What the behavior plan should not be is a list of all the progressively bad things that are going to happen to you if you do this again. So many behavior plans that I've seen over the years are basically taking the student code of conduct and restating it all in a plan that says, when you do it the first time, this is what we're going to do to you. And when you do it the second time, it's going to get worse. This is what we're going to do to you. And it's just like this list of all the stuff that happens to everybody else anyway. It doesn't make any sense. We need to really build in that positive and the instructional piece. Okay, antecedent strategies are anything that we can set up ahead of time to be more preventative. So thinking about, are there specific things in the environment that we can change? Where the kids sit, who they sit with, maybe the type of seating. We don't want ball chairs for everybody in the classroom, but for this student, having different seating than what they've been in may make a difference. Making sure that there isn't something odd going on that's if things are related to sensory. Maybe I get really cold and you've got me seated next to the window and it gets super cold over there. Smells can be a huge thing. I would not recommend that teachers ever wear perfume, or even like super intense like body lotions that, I could think smelling like a strawberry is great, but it can really set some kids off. And I've seen some kids be like very motivated by things. Like I've had kids who will work so hard to be able to get a squirt of special smelly lotion, right? And then I've had other kids that if you have a plug-in air freshener in your room, every time they walk in your room, they're having meltdowns when they don't in other rooms. So sometimes when we start gathering data, we can notice things like that. Is there anything related to hunger, right? If a kid is hungry in your classroom and, right before lunch, you see that's where the behaviors are occurring, is there something we could do? Can we provide a snack? Can we, maybe get mom and dad to wait and have the kid get totally ready and then eat breakfast right before they come, or breakfast at school or something like that. There are a lot of different things here that we can manipulate. Behavioral momentum can be a really big thing. So that's the last one out of this group that I'm going to go over, because I think you've really probably got a handle on the others. But using behavioral momentum or structuring things, any of you that have had training related to autism have probably heard things in terms of red, yellow, and green tasks. So a green task is something that I really like to do, or it's really easy for me to do. Doesn't take a lot to get me to do it. Yellow is something that's kind of in the middle. It's not my favorite, but I'll do it. It's not a problem. And those red tasks are the things that, man, it's like pulling teeth to even get you to start. And sometimes I'm going to have behaviors when you come up against those things. Well, what we don't want to do is structure a kid's day so that I'm asked to go from a green task directly to a red task. Meaning, if you ask me to eat my dessert and then my bowl of Brussels sprouts, I'm not eating those Brussels sprouts, right? But if maybe we can structure things differently, where I've got some momentum going, right? Maybe I do a yellow task, so I'm already moving, I'm working. You're not having to, you're not dealing with the behaviors. And then we move to a red task and it's followed by a green task. So there's some sort of, like pushing that car a little bit so that it's already rolling to get up over that hump, and then things get a little easier. But again, if you ask me to go from recess to writing, and I really don't like to sit and write, you're going to have a much harder time getting this kid to ever write than if maybe we were doing some craft or reading and then moved into writing, and we know right after writing comes recess. Okay. So this is all about how do I try and manipulate things so that I'm more likely to get success and more likely to get fewer behaviors happening. Now, the positive consequence strategies, we have to really know the function of behavior so that when we see an appropriate behavior or a positive behavior, that we make sure that the function the student was trying to get with the inappropriate behavior gets met here. Okay. So let's think about this, and you guys chime in, and you guys have all sorts of comments here, and I'm not even keeping up with these. If the function of behavior was attention, if I'm looking for any sort of attention, then when I see positive behavior, I can give praise, right? That's one form of attention. We know praise doesn't work with everyone, though. You don't praise many middle school boys. They don't like it. We've got to find other ways to give them attention, right? Instead of, good job. What else could we do? What are some other ways to provide attention when we see a positive behavior? That's good, Adria. You must have some good middle school boys. What else could you do that would provide some sort of attention? You can type it in the chat, or you're welcome to just jump in as well. Now, gift cards might be more for tangibles. If they're looking for a tangible. Now, the act of handing them the card could be some praise or attention, just getting recognition of some sort. So it could be a fist bump. That's getting some praise or attention. Giving them certificates, hanging out with them, yes. It could be that they get to, their name gets put on the good board, right? Instead of your name getting on the board for the negative stuff, it's I'm putting your name up here because you're getting a bonus point later. You're getting some sort of recognition or praise. Social interaction with other, some hanging out time with their friends. Sorry about that, Kristen. That's not good. So a lot of things that you could do. But again, you're going to want to make sure and build in the positives that relate to the function of behavior. If you don't, it may not be effective. If we're not getting the need met, this whole process was about what was your need that behavior was trying to meet for you, and how can we meet it with something appropriate? So escape or avoidance, choice might be one thing. Sometimes I just want to leave laundry until the last minute, until I have no more clothes left. That's my escape. So what are other ways that we could deal with escape or avoidance when that's what I need? Like, maybe I'm a kid who, when I want to escape a situation, I turn over my desk, right? Because I need out of there, or I need not to do what you're asking me to do. When the student is doing something positive and says, I need a break, that's an appropriate way to say, I need a break. So what could we do? Secret signals. I love this, especially when we get older kids. They don't want to have to say, I'm overwhelmed, I need a break, or I need to get out of here. Having a signal, absolutely. Bean bags. Yeah, having not a timeout area, but a chill area, or something that says I can appropriately go and just get out of this for a little bit. For some kids, it's just being able to put their head down and close their eyes for a few minutes. I need to back out of this. Getting a drink, lots of things like that. A get out of homework card, right? You give me enough appropriate behavior, homework is pointless anyway. So you do what you're supposed to do. Maybe getting a free pass kind of reward might be appropriate. So you can see how this works. But the idea is, if we don't know what that function is, then the positives, we don't know that they're going to work. Sticker charts don't work for most people. They just don't. But if really what I need is attention and praise and that kind of stuff, then a sticker chart may be all I need. But it all has to do with, what did I need in the first place? Okay, the negative consequence strategies. Again, this is kind of where the old behavior plans would go. It was nothing but negative consequences. So when we do have the behavior that we were concerned about in the first place, it's still going to occur some. It just is. So we have to make sure that, number one, we've taught you an alternative, that you've got something else you could do instead of that. Because if my only go-to is to run, then I'm going to keep running. So give me something else. We need to teach it. We need to practice it. We need to reinforce it and give feedback and all of that kind of stuff. And we need to make sure that it's actually a feasible behavior for the student. We've got students that are all along a continuum of skill sets and situations. And, there's some kids that it's not reasonable yet to ask them to do something different because they're just not capable. Now, when they are, then there has to be some sort of a consequence. We can't just say, you know, you get a free pass because you have a disability. That's not the way the world works either. But we need to make sure that giving the student a consequence does not reinforce the behavior. And, you know, I think my biggest pet peeve on this one are the students who clearly the function of behavior is escape or avoidance, and we suspend them. Right? Woohoo! They got a vacation. That's what I wanted. I didn't want to be in school. I didn't want to do that work. And you just told me that that's exactly what I'm going to get. Makes no sense whatsoever. And I think for us as professionals, knowing how that function is related to how we should respond gives you some good terminology to maybe use when you're working with your administrators to say, now let's think about this. You know, what is the student trying to accomplish? Let's make sure that we're not feeding into that, because if we do, again, we strengthen that relationship between the negative behavior, and we don't want that to happen, because the more that we strengthen it, the harder it is to ever undo what we've just done. Okay, so some different strategies. There are things that just can be used on a regular basis without even having to have these in a plan. So these are just general behavior management, classroom management kinds of tasks, or classroom management kinds of interventions and strategies that are that help reduce behaviors and maybe help avoid some of the FBAs and BIPs that we need to do. So some of that is around chunking things, having some sort of routine or predictability in class. So having things like, this is always where I write the homework on the board, or this is always where you turn in work. This is always where you store your backpack, all of those kinds of things. Lots of things that we can do as adults as far as modeling and using think alouds. You know, not just having everything written, but using visuals and using that out loud piece of, first I'm going to do this. Well, next I'm going to do this. It really can go a long way with supporting students. Using proximity. You know, I've been in a classroom before where I rarely saw the teacher get up from her desk, and there were behavior problems in every corner of the room. But walking around the classroom in and of itself can help reduce behavioral issues. Walking over near someone. I try to use proximity when I'm doing training in person and I've got some chatty people. Doesn't work so well with adults. They don't, it just doesn't work quite as well. But with students, when you get near them, they straighten up, they quiet down. Lots of different things that we can use to help kind of decrease some of the frustration. Using things like not yet. You know, I want to do this. Well, not yet, but now we're going to do this. Then we're going to do that. Just using really good language. And then I'm sure you all have seen a million different videos on YouTube and TikTok of the teachers greeting students as they come into their classroom, either with, you know, high fives, hugs, or handshakes. But now I know with COVID, all that's kind of craziness, but greeting students by name, having secret handshakes, you know, all that kind of stuff that takes time, it takes effort, but it pays off. You know, the teachers who know students well and can ask them things like, how's your dog doing? How's your sister doing? How was your basketball game? That says, I know you and I care about you. That can really improve behavior in a classroom. So the individualized stuff that we can do, sometimes we have to do some setting up or pre-correction with the student. You know, this is going to be coming up. I'm going to be asking you to write this afternoon. I know writing is really frustrating for you, and it's definitely not your favorite subject. So I'm going to go ahead and let you in on a secret of what the topic is, so you can already be thinking about it. You know, things like that. Even things like questions or participation. We have some students who will never raise a hand to answer a question. And so they never get in the habit of raising their hand and asking a question. And I'm never going to get comfortable and good at something if I don't have some practice doing it. So for some of our kids, just saying, today I'm going to ask you this question. Here's the answer, right? I gave you the answer. So when I ask that question, I want you to raise your hand and I'm going to call on you, and you know the answer already. No fear of being wrong, but it just gets me in that habit. Giving students jobs. I worked with a student, or I didn't work directly with a student, but I worked in a case conference on a student with significant behavioral issues. And the psychologist, behavior consultant who was working with the student gave the student a morning job at the flagpole with raising the flag. This student was suddenly there every day on time and keeping their behavior in check, because that job was my job and I get to do it every day and nobody else does. And it's important because if I'm not there, the flag doesn't go up. There are some times when jobs get rotated, and there are other times when this kid needs to have the job that they are good at and they know is theirs. And that's okay. You know, not everything is the same for all students. Okay. Teaming on a behavior plan is just like the process with teaming for a functional behavioral assessment. It cannot be a one-man operation. It just can't. And not only does everyone need to come together to create the plan, then it is absolutely essential that everyone is carrying out the plan that interacts with the student. So we're going to have more of a shot of a behavior plan actually making a difference and being effective if, number one, we have spent a good chunk of time figuring out exactly what the behavior is. When we don't clearly define the behavior in the first place, the FBA is not likely to be quite as accurate. We may have that broad view of everything without very specific things. And it's hard to figure out, well, if I don't exactly know what the misbehavior is, how do I know what I'm going to replace it with? What do I need to look at for the student? So spend that time coming together on defining the behavior, pulling together input of the team. Now, I can write a beautiful behavior plan, but if the teacher doesn't want to implement my plan because they say it's too time consuming, it's too complicated, it's not going to work, right? So we have to get input from that team to say, what do we think has a good shot at working? What is doable in the classroom? What is the least intrusive thing that we can do for the teacher, for the student, for calling attention to the kid? All of that kind of stuff is important. We need to have the parent and the student giving input into the plan as well. Students will tell you that's not going to work. If they say that, they're right. I mean, just hands down, if the student says it will not work, it is not going to work. If the student can give some input, then they've already got a little bit of buy-in into the system. And if they've got some buy-in, then we're more likely to see some positive outcomes. The plan needs to be very explicit and detailed and understandable. Have you ever read a behavior plan and thought, I'm not sure how, like, what is supposed to be happening here? Plan sounds kind of good, but doesn't necessarily tell me how this should happen. So we need to have enough detail to where when we share it with all of the staff involved, that it is very clear what they're supposed to do. If it's not, and they do things different, you could run into a problem later if it's ever questioned of, did you carry out the plan as written? Need to share it with everyone who interacts with the student where we are likely to see that behavior. And for some of our kids, that includes the cafeteria. So whoever's monitoring that student during that time needs to know what the plan is. For some students, it may involve the bus. For some students, it may involve the coach who is coaching a school-sponsored sport where this kid participates. I had a school district recently that shared with me that they had a situation where a student had a behavior plan during the day, and the student then went to a basketball game, was on the basketball team, and had an interaction with somebody, and then knocked the kid out. And that behavior, if it had happened during the school day, would have been addressed one way, but it was handled very differently. That's still school-related activity. So, I mean, it's not that we always have to involve everyone, but if there is a chance that this is going to need to follow a student into a different setting that is connected with school, we need to make sure that we cover all bases. We need to make sure that the plan is followed with fidelity. So again, when we've got the detail that we need and the clarity in the plan, then we're likely to have a greater level of doing it the right way. I also have to make sure that we're monitoring progress, and that progress will tell us, do we need to modify the plan? And is it working? Is it not? A behavior plan is not, in most cases, is not going to carry us through a whole year. There are going to be some tweaks that have to happen as we gather more information. So again, let's think back to the role of you all as diagnosticians. One of the things that you can really be helpful within the process is to make sure that we are keeping it positive. So keeping that focus on teaching skills, reinforcing skills, and rewarding appropriate behavior, as opposed to hitting that negative end of things. Also really helping, that should say supporting the teacher in understanding the role of the function. So again, I think sometimes we do an FBA, we complete the paperwork, check, put it aside, and then we develop a behavior plan without looking back. And that is such a critical link. And I think just as diagnosticians, being able to connect with the teacher who maybe is developing this within an IEP meeting or even outside of an IEP meeting and say, okay, now let's make sure that what we're doing is really connecting back to getting this kid's needs met and not strengthening a bad behavior by inappropriately responding to it. You may be able to help the rest of the staff who have to implement this plan know exactly what to do to increase that level of implementation. You also have a good bit of knowledge in data, and sitting down and helping teachers periodically to look at the data they have to see, should we keep the plan? Should we tweak the plan? What do we need to do? And then helping to support what those things might be. And again, with every major tweak or minor tweak, taking that back to the function of behavior to make sure that we didn't start out thinking clearly, and then as we started tweaking things, went away from what we knew about the function of the behavior. Okay, so I know we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. So I'm going to look back here at some of the comments here and see if there are any questions. not questions. You guys are just always really good about sharing good information with each other. Well, what questions does anyone have? So I know we've got some psychologists on here and some directors on here, as well as diagnosticians. Do you ever run into situations where you're like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with this?
Dr. McKinley, is there any way that the survey can be shared in the chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
And it will get emailed to all of you as well. So I'm also looking at Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann, I would say if you're already doing the OHI and you have permission, gathering some information through an FBA, I think, can just be part of that OHI. But if you go into it knowing I want a full FBA, I want to look at this very specifically, then I would go ahead and mark it as the FBA. I think to some degree, sometimes we start in with another health impairment evaluation and there's not a lot of behavioral stuff going on. There may be some inattention, or, it could be lethargy, or, something like that. And then we get in and see the kid and go, yeah, I need to take a closer look at this and see, is it really related to their medical condition, or is there something else going on that we could maybe make a bigger dent in, but you're safer to call the parent and say, I would like to also do this. Is that okay? So that's what I would do. Behaviors. So I think the earlier the better for getting a good handle on things. And if I've got mild behaviors, but they are getting in the way, you don't want them to escalate to something bigger. So being able to get in there and get ahead of the game really is going to be to your advantage. Sometimes we end up with kids that maybe are identified as having an emotional disability. And when we start looking back over the history, it started with some milder behaviors that just got to be happening more consistently and started grating on everyone's nerves. And then things started escalating even more. Ruth Ann, I think that scenario would be a really good one to gather a functional behavioral assessment. Absolutely. And I've had one of those before too, that when we started matching up, collecting behavior data and then matching up to sugar readings, it was clear that it was definitely related to the diabetes. And then there are other times where you look at the highs and lows and they don't seem to have any pattern related to the student's sugar level. So, I think you can get a lot of really good information from that. Yep, good advice, Will. Any other questions? All right, then if you guys would, as usual, just complete the evaluation form. I would appreciate it. Your feedback is always really helpful in trying to trying to make things better for the next one. So, Adra, that is a good question. I do not have any others scheduled right now. We do have diagnostician office hours next week, I think, which is just, it's not training, it's just open time for anybody to come and ask questions or get support or commiserate with each other or whatever we need to do. I will send the link to sign up for that for anyone who hasn't done that in the past. Because the last couple that I've done, it's been me. I've been all alone for an hour. So anybody is welcome to come to those, but I will send a link to that when you guys get your email from this training. I know I did have a couple of people mention last time that if we could maybe repeat the impromptu training that we did on SLD pattern of strengths and weaknesses models, then I will probably try to set up one of those for those of you who weren't part of that. And I'm not sure when that will be though, but we'll try to get that scheduled pretty soon. And absolutely, if anybody comes up with another idea for something, you know, a burning topic that they would like to see, then send that to me and we'll make it happen. So everybody have a wonderful day. This has been recorded, so it will be available in the playlist that is on the YouTube channel and also available through the Padlet.